Welcome to episode 9 of the Beyond podcast, where we have conversations with people who we find inspiring, who might inspire you too. Our special guest for today's episode is Thomas Boot. Thomas is a software engineer at GitHub, where he works on GitHub Actions. Before that, he worked at Microsoft, WillowTree, and IBM as a software engineer. He studied at North Carolina State University, earning his Bachelor of Science in Computer Science. Welcome, Thomas. How's it going?
Great, and I'm happy to be here. Really excited to get to come talk with all of you today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Um, yeah, I'm super excited to have you on the podcast because last summer I interned on Thomas's team with the rest of the GitHub Action runtime team, and that was a really great experience. Thomas kind of served as like an impromptu mentor and like answered all the questions I had about, I guess, transitioning into like full-time software engineering and stuff like that because uh, soon I'll be working at GitHub. So very, very excited for that. So I guess jumping right into it, what is it like to work as a software engineer now that you have a few years under your belt in terms of like working full time as a software engineer? What is it like?
I love it. I think the big thing to me with software engineering is I like to make things and sort of deliver that to the world. So, software is a great way to prototype on something quickly, put it out there for people to see, and then get feedback on that.
Mhm.
And personally, that's what gets me up in the morning, being able to make these really cool apps or really cool items for individuals or companies or people. And honestly, I think that's great. Software is also challenging. Software's can be frustrating at times, but I think ultimately it's a great experience. If you are considering the field, definitely look into it more.
Mhm. And like what motivated you to like pursue software engineering? Um, did you discover it during college or like before that? What was like your journey to, I guess, pursue this full time and have this as your career?
So I actually wasn't fully decided through like till halfway through college. In high school, I did a lot of chemistry. I was looking at basically way I took like the standard electives most high schoolers take, but then on top of that, I took a number of chemistry courses, including a class called computational chemistry, which was using computer modeling to basically approximate where electrons could be, among other things, but trying to model chemical reactions and individual molecules using supercomputers. That sort of led me into when I entered college, I was torn between that and like computer and electrical engineering. So I actually entered college with the idea of going into computer engineering. Got about halfway through college and had been lucky enough to find internships in software. So I was doing software internships while getting a degree in sort of a like hardware software mix. And I really enjoyed my software internships. I was working on some really cool projects. This was back when maybe Dropbox and stuff weren't as common, but I was working on an IBM competitor to Dropbox at the time, which would
Mm,
basically sync your local files to the cloud. And this wasn't that common back then. So it was really cool for me to work on. I
mhm.
found it really engaging to solve problems that people face. Like backing up data was significantly harder. There weren't as many tools. And that sort of led me to change my major. So I went into computer science, and I've been there ever since, working as a software engineer.
Cool. Yeah, that's super, super awesome. Like how you like had that exposure to internships in the middle of college and that kind of like switched your like decision to like pursue software engineering like full time, putting all that energy towards that. I guess like getting that first internship must have been difficult. Like what background did you have going into that internship? And I guess what key experiences helped prepare you to like build like that really awesome like I guess, competitor to Dropbox during your time at IBM? Like, what prepared you to, take that huge task as like a very young software engineer?
I think getting your first internship is probably the thing that people have the most trouble with. And I'm not going to lie, there's definitely a bit of luck there. There's some level of practicing for interviews you can do. And I'll be honest, I bombed a bunch of interviews that semester. I was a freshman I was in my freshman year when I was interviewing for these, and I can think back to some of the interviews that had some pretty advanced like data structure questions they were asking freshmen, and I did not do well on those. I hadn't read it up on any of that. I hadn't taken any of the courses. But I did have some stuff to talk about. I did have some relevant experience. I had done some software before. I had some experience with HTML, Java, and like CSS and JavaScript. Um, but I think it was more about showing you wanted to learn and grow. And I think someone decided to give me a chance, and I'm very grateful for that. And I stayed at IBM actually for every one of my internships after that. So I was very
Mm,
thankful for that. So um like I was very happy being there, and I think they were happy to have me, and I definitely felt like I grew over the course of those internships. So
mhm. What made you so happy like at IBM and like made you want to like do more internships there and continue after you graduate? Like what were the key parts of IBM that I guess cultured that growth that you mentioned earlier on?
um sorry. I think it's been a while, so this is maybe rose tinted glasses, but I really liked the team I was on. In particular, I
Hmm.
had a IBM had, or at least the team I was on, had split like people managers versus like project or engineering managers. So the person who was in charge of my project, our like engineering manager, was a fantastic role model. Basically, someone who taught me a lot of what I know, and mainly more of the like soft skills of like when do I raise an issue, when do I like how do I make decisions in software, and I think those are sort of the harder skills that a lot of new grads have trouble with. It's generally the programs you have to write aren't as complex at a junior engineer level, but knowing how to interface with organizations and how to navigate hierarchies and sort of get from the idea of a feature stage to how to get to the implementation and how to get that shipped is generally the harder part. And I think I remember working with him very fondly and felt like I learned a lot working with him. He did a lot of one-on-one mentoring, and since I was getting a lot out of the internships, I felt that I should stay there because I felt like it was helping me grow a lot.
Hmm. That's super cool, and thank you for sharing that. And I had a similar experience during my time at GitHub. I didn't want to mention that, like releasing something from like just an idea to like a feature and like getting customer feedback is like really difficult. I had a difficult time like doing like learning all that and ramping up in it. But the key thing that made me want to return to GitHub was like the people like you and like Eric, like Ross and everyone else and Ting, um, working with like amazing people as well as like maximizing my growth and like I don't know, I see like a lot of like similarities between our like internship experiences. I think that's like really great. And for our like listeners who I guess are in the early stages of I guess their software engineering journey, what do you think are some skills that are important to focus on early on in college to like I guess one, get an internship, and two, to do well in an internship?
Um, I think the big thing I want to stress to a lot of engineers is that when you get your foot in the door at somewhere that's maybe historically pretty difficult to get into, imposter syndrome is a very big thing. You're going to feel like you don't belong to be there. You just got lucky, or some other reason why you shouldn't be in that door. And something I used to tell people that I mentored at other companies and the like is once you've made it through that interview process, if you fail or you flunk out, that's on us. We need to provide the materials that you need to succeed. And yes, you should raise your hand if you're not receiving those, but you're there for a reason. A lot of these interview processes in software are very difficult. There most positions weed out, I don't know, 80 to 90, 95, 99% in some cases of applicants. It might even be more than that, and the ones who do make it through deserve to be there. As to like advice for like getting your first internship, I think it's really important to focus on sort of the interview process and also your resume workshops. If you're going through a traditional route, like you're a college student who's looking for an internship or a first job after graduation, Most colleges will host resume building workshops, and they will host mock interviews, and you should go to those. Some of them may not even be relevant to your field. There's a lot of mock interviews that are just behavioral, but you're going to get all of those behavioral questions, and those are going to be important. They are going to have a yes or no say in if you get the job or not, and they get a lot easier the more you do them. Or you can
Mhm.
apply to like every company under the sun and do thousands of real interviews to get the practice, but
Get the
that's a little
experience,
more,
yeah.
yeah, that's a little more stressful.
Yeah. And I definitely agree with that. Like practice makes perfect. And I honestly like it took a long time for me to understand how important it was to like develop like a good practice schedule and like just like practice and make it a habit. I think for me initially when I was studying for interviews, I didn't it was just too tiring for me, like especially like with like my coursework and like my extracurriculars. But like once you like make time for it and you make it a habit, I think that's when you really see improvements and results for interviewing, I guess. But yeah, I really like your point about imposter syndrome though, and contextualizing, I guess, um, where you are when you are interviewing. Like you're there for a reason, and it's important to consider the context in which you're in. And yeah.
And speaking about like extracurriculars and the like, somewhat embarrassing story, but the semester where I did all of these interviews and like I did tons and tons of interviews, my grades definitely dropped. I
Mm,
indexed on the interviews versus spending as much time studying as I should have, and that could have turned out bad had I not landed an internship. But yes, it is a lot of time involved in some of that, and sort of managing your time is going to be difficult, especially in college where you have a million other things to do. And also, like in college, you want to be social, you want to do other things as well that are maybe not directly relevant to your career, but they prevent you from burning out. So
mhm.
managing your time can be difficult. Try to do that as best you can.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think another thing that goes hand in hand with that is like when you get rejected by companies. I think it really hurts in the beginning when you get like your first like 5 rejections or so, at least for me. And I took it personally. Like I would look back at like my email and be like, "Oh, what did I do wrong? Like why did the interviewer not like me?" And I took everything very personally, but then when I like realized that there were so many other candidates and like I can only focus on, improving myself, that's when I started to, I guess, get better at handling rejection and moving on and doing better in future interviews. I guess how do you deal with like, I guess, rejection and like what have you learned now that you're like now a full-time software engineer and worked a few years in the industry?
I think rejection's going to happen. It's you're never gonna hit 100% of the shots you take, especially sometimes you're a great engineer and it's a great company and the skill
Mm,
set they're looking for doesn't align with your skill set, or the experience level they need doesn't align with your experience level. And you find out at the end of the interview process, and that can happen. I think it's important to just kind of hold your head up and move on from that experience. Something that may be frustrating to you is a lot of companies do not provide information on why you were not chosen. Um, this is intentionally done. It helps avoid lawsuits, among other things, and some
right.
companies do. And you should index on what information you're given, and you can also ask for more information, and they may respond, they may not. Don't feel bad if they don't. Some companies just have policies against it.
Yeah.
But think of it as a learning experience. You're going to learn to do better on the next interview process. And I've been rejected
Mhm.
from a number of companies, and I've been given offers to a number of companies. I think it's just sort of part of the process.
Yeah,
It's
I definitely agree with that. That's a really good point. And I think like in terms of learning from like I guess mistakes or failures is really important. I know like in the past few years what I do is I just jot down like things I think I did poorly, like whether it's like, oh, maybe I could have communicated on like this bug I was on during this interview, and just like taking those notes and like focusing on those areas really helped for me, or like certain concepts I didn't do that well. That's what really helped for me to succeed. um I guess like moving past that now, like when you are working in the software engineering field, what do you think are the most important skills to succeed? Right, it's one thing to do well in the interviews, and have a strong understanding of the fundamentals of like data structures and like computer science and software. What do you think are the most applicable skills and the most important skills to succeed as a software engineer?
I think I'm gonna go a different way than you might be expecting with this, but I
Hmm.
think for the most part, I don't see too many issues with fundamentals of software engineering. Most people who have gone through the interview process are able to program at the level expected of them. I think it's more about the soft skills. Like thinking through situations where you need to collaborate with a larger team and work towards a common goal and get your feature into a sort of a project or a sort of bring a feature from the beginning to completion. Though there can be challenges there, mainly around figuring out who you need to talk to and why, making sure to raise your hand so you're not just burning time doing nothing or being confused. And also, like, if you're looking at other parts of the software industry, like client services or some of these other fields where you have to be communicating with clients or like larger organizations as a whole, knowing how and when to do that communication is very important. Um, I think the other thing that might separate like good engineers from great engineers is being able to take your changes as like a small part of a larger system and see how they will impact that system. Depending on where you work, the code bases may be relatively small. You may be working on new projects or they may be massive. And sometimes people come in and they'll make their changes and they'll think they work. And they do for the most part, but there's some unintended consequence as a result in this massive system. So knowing how to like identify what areas you need to check and what areas you need to sort of understand in more detail before you proceed is sort of a learned skill that can be difficult if you're not used to code bases that large.
Hmm. Yeah, I think those are two great points. Like one where I kind of expected that from you because like when I talked to you over summer, it seems like you I guess like you really live by that, like the importance of like communicating with people and really prioritizing that at work is really important. Um, I guess a follow-up question to that specifically about communicating. Um, what do you think are most important, like, or not most important, what do you think are the key differences between like remote and like in-person work when it comes to communicating? Like, I guess like when I was interning remotely at GitHub, I was really scared about like how am I going to communicate effectively? Do you have any like tips or like lessons you've learned since you worked in person and remotely as a software engineer?
Yeah, so this is actually an interesting subject for me. For those who don't know, GitHub is an entirely remote first company. So the idea is that all communication happens over either Slack or meetings or other things that occur outside a physical, like everyone get in a room and let's talk about something. Nearly all the companies I worked at before this were geolocated in a or at least my teams were geolocated in a single city. IBM's not all in one city. Um, and those teams would basically just get in a room and talk through things. I think there's different things for different people. Some people have trouble getting motivated in the morning if they're just going to go sit on their computer at their desk at home and sort of work with their team like that. And it's not definitely not for everyone. I will say the era we're living in now, everyone's working from home due to like an outbreak of a pandemic. But most people, or at least a number of engineers I've worked with, like being in person and having their coworkers in a building with them and being able to talk with them. And there maybe reading facial expressions and reading nonverbal cues is important in those contexts. In sort of a remote company, honestly, a lot of the communication is asynchronous. So people may be in different time zones, they may be in different areas of the world. And being able to write things down and document things and make sure decisions bubble up to people who may be asleep when you're making them is very important. So I had to do a bit of learning there, making sure like, hey, I wrote things down effectively and I gave proper people time to review and like give their feedback. And also sifting through a lot of written communication to find the information I need in order to do my job has been some stuff I've had to work on a bit, but I think those are useful skills. Like writing good documentation is going to make
Mm,
you a great software engineer anywhere. It's maybe a little more important in asynchronous companies, but
gotcha, gotcha. That's super super helpful, I think, for a lot of people who are, I guess, now working in like a remote environment, or going to like work in a remote environment. Um, I guess building on that, um, for a sense of like community, what do you think are the best ways to like build a community, like at work or like beyond, when it comes to like a remote setting? And the reason why I asked that is like for me, school is still remote. Um, and building a sense of community is something I'm like trying to like learn like hands on, like through my clubs. I'm curious, like based on like your experiences or I guess your insights, like do you have any thoughts on that? Like building a sense of community in a remote environment?
I think community very much depends on the number of people you're talking about. If you're talking like smaller groups, building, I don't know, a shared set of either, I'm not going to say values, but let's go with values, and like sort of understanding of each other, and sort of doing the activities that will allow your community to bond together and get to know each other more and sort of move towards back past like a hey, I vaguely know of you versus like I understand your interests and like we have things to talk about stage. If you're looking at like larger groups than that, it's generally like based on how you segment that community. I'm thinking like organizational culture here, but at like a very large company, culture tends to be like org or team specific rather than company specific. There's some commonality, but it's very hard to push culture from top down in like any community. You can't have one person say, here's what our culture is going to be. You sort of need to build a shared understanding with everyone in that community and sort of have it be more grassroots culture wise. So basically finding the right people and coming to an understanding on, hey, here's how we should operate and here's like here's why we're here and like here's our shared expectations and values and sort of operating based on that typically works well.
Gotcha. I think all of that was is super super interesting. Um, and also, I guess a similar question I had in mind was something I worry about, like whenever I'm moving to a new city or I'm starting something new. Like when I graduate, I'm gonna be in a totally new city, even though it's close by. Like I'm gonna be in like the like SF versus like Berkeley. It's only 1 hour away, but it's totally different in terms of culture, and there are gonna be different people I meet there. I'm not gonna be with the same friends I had in college necessarily. So I guess like what were some things you learned, I guess, um, throughout your experiences that are helpful for adjusting to new environments, whether it's graduating from college or moving between jobs? Like, what have you found to be helpful for, I guess, finding your own community, finding friends, finding a good rhythm? What has been helpful for adjusting to new environments?
Yeah, so for context here, I grew up and went to college in the same area of the country. So when I graduated college, I had offers from various areas in the country, honestly, all over from California to New York. But ultimately, I picked going to Austin, Texas, which where I had never been before. I vaguely knew one person who lived there and sort of just moved halfway across the country on a whim for a job I thought would be really cool. And it was really cool. But it was sort of unnerving moving halfway across the country to go to a place where I didn't really know anyone or anything. And sort of what I did there was I bonded with my coworkers pretty quick. We had a lot in common, and we started hitting up some of the bars and some of the other areas where people our age would hang out. And we met other people there and just formed a small group where we would talk and play games, among other things. And I think there's always going to be websites like meetup.com or various others where you need to find something you're genuinely interested in doing. And if you are interested in doing it, there's likely a good chance other people are interested in doing it. And you just need to find those communities. Sometimes you'll go somewhere and you'll realize it's not a fit and you have to leave and or you don't want to come back and that's fine. That's sort of you're not going to mesh with everyone you meet, but I think it's more about putting yourself out there and trying rather than just staying home all day because you know no one and being like, well, this sucks. I don't know anyone. And I think that can
Mhm.
be a little challenging to overcome, but I think it's worth it. If you're moving somewhere you don't know people or if you're trying to build a community or something, you kind of have to advertise yourself or put yourself out there, right?
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's super hard. At least for me, and I know for a lot of other people, like the way that I imagine like my life so far is like I've been in school, like it's really easy to make friends at school. It's like people are studying with you and like you're in a similar environment. Or like at internships, like at least for me, it's really easy to like make friends because you're both interning, you're exploring a city or whatnot. Um, but like when you graduate from college, there doesn't seem to be like I guess something like shared except for like your hobbies, which is great. And like that seems a little bit more challenging to like find like I guess um areas to explore in that. Like meetups seem cool and stuff like that, and like going to bars seem cool as well. But like I guess like getting over that mental hurdle, were you like ready to like put yourself out there immediately when you went to Austin, or did it take some time to, have that sort of mindset?
Um, Being honest, when I went to Austin, I didn't have a lot of money left. So once my first couple paychecks came, I was ready to go like meet people and do more things. But I think the maybe to take some of the anxiety out of this situation is if you're at a small company, typically the culture there, typically you'll see small companies, they'll put in like, I don't know, video game systems and they'll bring in kegs and they'll bring in all sorts of other things to sort of develop the culture. It's a pretty common thing at smaller companies, especially in Silicon Valley, where you get to know your coworkers more and all of that. If you're at a larger company, even if your team doesn't have anyone your age, there's typically special interest groups. Pick something you're interested in. For like running or biking are
Mm,
pretty huge ones at the company I'm at right now. But you're probably going to find people with those same interests. And you can sort of bridge that to meet other people who might also have that interest as well. But yeah, I tend to be pretty outgoing. So as soon as like I had the money to do some of the more exciting things, and Austin's a phenomenal city. If you haven't visited it, highly recommend. I was pretty ready to go out there, but also I was hanging out with a lot of my coworkers too, and I got to see them every day via work and stuff. So
gotcha. Um, and I guess like currently now, working at GitHub, what has that been like? And what are your like favorite parts about working at GitHub now as a remote software engineer?
I think the main thing when I come to GitHub is I think it's very cooperative. We have a large percentage of the world's open source libraries on GitHub. So like there's just a culture already of being very cooperative and working together with these broader communities. But also just internally, GitHub is very cooperative. You get to work with all sorts of teams and everyone's sort of focused on building something together. It's never a sense of, hey, this isn't my problem. I'm not working on that, which has been really awesome. So you get to work with these larger geo-distributed teams towards like a common goal, which has been amazing. Um, Outside of that, I would say it's very engaging and at times pretty challenging. The GitHub code base isn't that small. It's fairly large and there's a lot of different moving parts and it's can be pretty challenging to understand those moving parts and how they fit together and how we actually design those into comprehensive solutions. But that also makes it engaging. I work on different things um, from I'm not going to say day by day basis, but like every couple of weeks or something, I'll be working in a completely different area, working on something completely new, and it might even be in a different programming language. So that makes it like a constant process of learning and growing, and that adds some challenge as well. But it's been honestly an incredible experience. Highly recommend GitHub, but there's lots of great companies out there, and you should find what meshes well with you. Particularly, I know remote only might not work for some people.
Gotcha. And for like ramping up on, I guess the domain knowledge for all these different things that you're working on at GitHub, what have you found to be the most helpful in terms of like strategies for ramping up quickly? Like for me during my internship, I think I relied a lot on meeting with senior software engineers and people who have more experience and just asking them like why they made certain design decisions and understanding like the context behind like certain like code bases and pieces of code. I guess what worked for you or what works for you for ramping up on
I think
knowledge?
Sorry, I think learning is different per person. I do a lot of reading, so I rely pretty
Mhm.
heavily on documentation. It turns out our documentation is pretty good. but also meeting with people to understand, hey, here's how I understand it. Is that approximation or is this mental model I'm building in my head correct? And that works pretty well for me because typically it's really easy for someone to say yes, but, or no, that's completely off. Let's talk about it. And then we talk about it, and then I have a better understanding for the future. But ramping up on hard code bases, especially if you're a like just out of school or a junior engineer, can be very difficult. You should ask if you don't have someone already. You should be paired with someone as like a mentor or a someone to sort of guide you in that process. And if they don't have the answers for you, they should be able to point you to someone who will have those answers. Some companies drive a model of this is person A and they own everything in this area of the code base. This is person B and they own everything here. So if you have questions in these areas, you just need to ask them. And people at the organization know who all these people are, but you may have not have been there that long and you're just like, well, how am I supposed to find this out? It's like, oh, go talk to person B, and you may have not known that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important. Is like something I learned during my internships was the importance to ask for help when you need it. I think, especially as an intern, I get caught up like, oh, I want to like do my best work. I don't want to be a burden on people. I don't want to like bother people. That's like my mindset when I was an intern. And I think it's like really important to like reach out, and then sometimes someone will have the like domain knowledge to point you to like someone else who has like even more knowledge, and so on and so on. And that's important to do, to ask for help. um but I guess like over your time working at GitHub, what were some like key lessons you've learned in terms of building software? You worked on like a lot of different cool things, I'm sure. Um, but like, what do you think makes like software like well designed or like robust, scalable? Like, what do you think are the key aspects, especially on the thing we're working on, like GitHub Actions, which is used by a lot of people?
I think something I'm going to talk about something I learned pretty early in my career at another company, but I worked at a place that was heavily driven by UX, and it was essentially how does this impact the user? What's the primary flow here? What are the other flows? And like, what's the golden path through this? And how are we going to design our solutions to take in 99% of customers want to do this, but we also need to support these other flows for customers who maybe have advanced requirements or need additional features, and sort of just keeping the user in mind and keeping like the percentages of these paths in mind. You want to make the golden path the simplest for the majority of users who are using it. And then you want to offer these additional features. And that's something that still sticks with me today. We don't build software to enable features, we build software for users, and we need to focus on the user in order to build the best software. Um, that's sort of what guides a lot of my principles today. It's why I like shipping code so much, because then you get to see how the users like it and you get to see what assumptions you made were super valid and what assumptions maybe could be improved. And you get to sort of iterate that on grow a bit, which sort of works well where I am now. We have a very big ship to learn mindset where you ship something that's not like you haven't done any research at all, but you've done a good approximation of what you know and you're going to ship it. And if there's some feedback there, we'll iterate that on that as needed. As for like, to answer your question more about like engineering at a scale, I think the best answers I have for that is learning how to track data. Basically, you need to go ahead and have some place where you can store metrics, store traceability, among other things. And then you need to have accountability there. So you monitor, hey, is our performance times on this endpoint increasing or something? And then as you monitor that, you can sort of look into your traceability and see, hey, 30% of our time is in the DB layer. Why are we in there for so long? This should be a simple get one row type deal. And you can sort of address, it's sort of adding accountability to your code. Every great organization has some level of accountability for the people in it. Well, let's add it to our code as well. Make sure we're accountable for what we add and make sure that that code is accountable for what is it doing what it needs to properly.
Mm. Gotcha. And for that sort of, I guess, traceability, I had a question related to that about, I guess, debugging issues in code, especially with like a large code base, like at GitHub. I guess what strategies do you use? I know like what I use for strategies, but I'm not sure if it's the most effective. Like what are some strategies you use for debugging like large pieces of code that might be really hard to navigate through?
So I think it's at what level you're starting this debugging. If you are like doing local development or doing development in a test environment that supports attaching a debugger, strongly recommend you attach a debugger. It'll probably make your life a lot easier, especially if you're a more junior developer. Um, if you're at a scenario in production and someone hands you a stack trace and goes, production's crashing, why? Those can be a little harder because sometimes they're heavily reliant on um, data shape. So what data could be causing that? And if you can't get access to that data, it can be a lot harder. There you sort of have to put on your mental map of the understanding of what code base, or sorry, what coding language you're in, sort of why it would crash in those scenarios, and sort of identify what could be going wrong. I think the biggest tips I have for that is get additional pairs of eyes. I'm a big proponent of paired programming, but sometimes you gloss over something as impossible or not likely when someone else may not have glossed over that, and that might be the key to your issue. And sort of take it as a collaborative approach and see what you can find out.
Mm. And I think that point about pair programming is super super cool, especially in the context of like remote, like in remote environments, whether it's like working or like an educational setting. I found like pair programming or pairing on an issue to be like really really effective. Surprisingly, like it, this summer has been like the first time like I tried pair programming, to be honest, in a professional setting, and it worked really well. Especially in the context of reviewing code. Like usually, the way that I review code is like, oh, you ask someone to review it on like GitHub or whatever, but like going through it and like adding comments with the person in the same Zoom room is super, super, super helpful for providing context to comments that the reviewer is adding. So yeah, just definitely want to like add on to that point, which is really, really helpful.
I agree
And I,
wholeheartedly. I love
yeah,
Zoom pull request reviews and the like.
yeah, and it is also great for like building camaraderie. Like I think I became like I really like working with the people I worked with at GitHub mainly because of the pair programming. Like I learned a lot and I think I also contribute a lot too. And yeah, that was just such a good experience and really brightened up my day. Like when you're remote, you don't get to like see your coworkers, so I like seeing people and like yeah, it just definitely brightens your day hearing about like different things that are going on in their lives as well. Um, and I guess similar to that point about pair programming, I learned about like the what's it called, the driver slash navigator framework at GitHub for like pair programming. I forget what it's exactly called, but like one person drives the conversation, someone looks over it, I think is the general gist of it. Um, are there anything else like that you think is helpful for pair programming for it to be effective? Um, is there a framework that you use, or do you just like go for it and just like treat it as just like a normal conversation you would have in an office?
I don't use any particular framework. I think it's important to raise your hand when something isn't working for you, though. Typically, you may run into issues where someone's going too fast, or let's say someone has their font size too small. You need to just raise your hand and be like, "Hey, this isn't working for me. Can you increase the size of your screen, or can you slow down a bit, or go back to this file to make sure I'm understanding why you're doing this?" And it's also, especially if you're not what you would call the driver, it's not time to like slack off or go look at Slack or I don't know. You have to be actively engaged, otherwise you're not getting a whole lot out of the session. You're just using two engineers in a place where you're only really using one. One of them's just not doing anything.
Fair point.
So I think you have to like meaningfully use it. But
Yeah, that's a good point. Like you should be 100% focused during pair programming and definitely don't slack off. Um, and I think that applies to a lot of things too, like putting 100% of your effort or like focusing wholeheartedly on an issue is really important for programming or whatever you're doing. Um, I guess what helps you stay focused um, while working on maybe a mundane issue or maybe like a really hard problem that you're working on for like a few weeks? Like, what helps you stay focused and motivated in those situations that might be like very challenging and frustrating as a software engineer?
So I think focus is something you need to sort of make for yourself. What I do is I schedule time where I'm focused on issues. If you ping me, I'll get back to you. Sorry, if you send me like a message on Slack, I'll get back to you. Or if you
Mhm.
send me an email, I'll get back to you when I'm done. And when I worked in person at companies, I would just let people know, hey, between like these hours in the afternoon, I'm going to be focused on bugs or whatever I'm working on that day. And if production's completely down and you need me, sure, interrupt me. But all the other questions, send them to me, and I'll get to them after. And I would go ahead, and a lot of the instant messaging tools and emails, you can just hide notifications for a couple hours, and you can just focus on what you're working on. There's a sort of cognitive load in working on something, switching off and switching back. And by just sort of focusing on one thing, you can sort of be a little more productive just overall. But you also have a responsibility to your team to like sort of engage collaboratively with them. So you can't just be like, I don't respond to things ever because I'm working. So there's a balance there, but I think it's important you find that balance and sort of strike that, because so you can enter like a state of focused work. If you can't do that at your company, it gets a lot harder.
Mhm. Yeah, and building on that for like finding that balance for focusing. It seems like it takes time, and I think similar to that point, how do you maintain the balance for, I guess, your energy? And I know this is a common issue in software engineering, and also for my school in particular, Berkeley. A lot of students burn out, and I heard like a lot of software engineers burn out too, just like working really hard on all these really complex challenges and doing a lot of great work, but reaching that like tipping point where they just simply burn out. Like, what do you think are some good strategies for, I guess, um, preventing burnout? Especially since I'm going into the industry, I'm curious, and I don't want to burn out, and I know it is very possible for any sort of software engineer. Like, what are some strategies and tips you have in that area?
So the first strategy I think is like 7 cups of coffee a day, so you're ready to take on the day. No, I'm just kidding. But I think the important thing that it took me a while to learn is your productivity is not maximized by just working a trillion hours a day or keeping
Mm,
yourself busy all the time. You're going to be more productive when you take the time to sort of adjust your work-life balance so you can come relaxed and recharged into the next day. And that's hard to teach and it's hard to enforce, but people are going to burn out if they're just focusing on work all the time. You can, like, especially if you're work from home and you have no other obligations, you can easily go work 14 hours a day. You're not going to be effective, but you probably could um, work that long. But sort of making sure you're taking the time to focus on other things. Go hang out with friends, go hang out with your family, go for a walk. I highly recommend walks, especially when you're thinking about issues or anything. In fact, in the middle
mm,
of my day, I normally go for a walk and just let people know I'll be gone for 30 minutes while I'm sort of just like getting some sunlight and thinking about what I'm working on. But I think another thing here is when you are focused on something, you should be focused on that. Mute your phone or like your personal phone when you're at work. When you're off work, don't spend all day thinking about work.
mm,
You need to sort of segment your time out to like use your time for what you're using it for to the fullest. So like if you're gonna take some like life balance and you're gonna go for a walk or you're gonna like go hang out with your family or something, don't think about work during it. And when you're at work, try to focus on your work. And I think
yeah,
that'll help.
yeah, I think that's super, super helpful. And I never really noticed this, but that point, especially like making sure you're fully focused on the activity you're doing, like whether like it's work, make sure you don't mix like personal stuff with that. I think that's super helpful. I didn't notice, but I did that too, like during my internships, being sure like I turn off my phone and notifications. And that I think is super helpful for productivity. And then when you're out of work, like similar to like turning off like Slack notifications if you're not on call or whatever. Um, but yeah, I guess so some questions I have related to work-life balance, like when you're on call, let's say, like when you have that phone where you have to fix like an issue if like something goes down. Um, I guess what has your experience been like being on call in general, and what tips do you have for like new engineers like me to be a good on-call engineer?
So I want to take this maybe two ways. The first is sort of what is on call and like what companies do it. On call is essentially you're in charge of the production site, and when it goes down or when something happens, you're sort of in charge to fix it. The best on call rotations are going to be ones that follow the sun. So during your normal work week, you will, when you're working your 9 to 5 or whatever it is, you will be in charge for your 9 to 5 work day. And then when you leave work, you're no longer in charge. Some other on call rotations are just like 24/7, and you might get a call in the middle of the night that wakes you up. I think the important thing with on call and being effective when you're on call is it's definitely an impact to work life balance if you're doing the one where you can be woken up in the middle of the night. I think what you want to focus on is making sure you're adequately prepared and making sure you're adequately compensated for that because it is extra hours you're working. And if your company overnight goes, hey, we're doing on call now and no changes to salary, that's probably not fair to you. But every place I've worked at that has done like nightly on calls where they've had to wake someone up in the middle of the night, they will compensate you for that. And if you were woken up in the middle of the night, you'll get some time off later to compensate for it. So I think it's just making sure there's a healthy balance of the company's your time and the company's time.
Hmm.
As if when you're preparing for it, definitely make sure you're adequately prepared. Make sure you go through trainings or whatever. If you have an on-call cycle without any training, that sounds like you should have a talk with your higher level management or at least express concerns to your manager because that doesn't sound like it's going to end well, to be honest.
Yeah. Um, that's super comforting. I think especially in on call, my imaginations of on call is like, oh, you like like you get waken up in the middle of the night and you have to resolve like these all these different issues, and then you have to wake up at like 8 a.m. the next day and then continue work. But I'm glad like what you mentioned, that like most companies like compensate for it or are really cognizant of like how it affects engineers.
I've been at a few places that do nightly, like you're on call overnight, and I've done a fair number of rotations, and I've only been woken up a couple times. That doesn't mean it'll be your experience everywhere. But typically, I don't look back at those experiences and say that was super stressful or bad. In fact, for most services, at least in my time zone, the load at night's pretty low. So you typically don't have as big of an issue there. Typically, a lot of software errors can be load based, and generally, you don't see those when the load's low.
Mm. And by like load based, do you mean like how many like people are like using the service at a time?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
gotcha. Um, yeah, thank you so much for like all that advice. And the last question I wanted to like ask you, just in general, like what tips do you have for people entering the software engineering space or people who are just graduating and starting their next journey in whatever professional area? Like, what advice do you have for um, young new grads who are entering the workforce right now?
I feel like I could go a couple ways with this, but I think the way I most want to go is find out what's going to make you excited to get up in the morning. You're probably going to be working 40 hours a week, maybe more, maybe less, doing something every week for the next foreseeable future. And you need to find something that gets you excited to wake up. There's software, I think, one of my frustrations with it, and I talked about how I did all my internships at the same place is other fields, medical is a great example, will do paid externships, which is like a 1 to 3 week rotation at area A or B, where you try out all the different areas of being like a medical doctor, for example. And you get to sort of experience those and see if you would like them. I think it's sort of harder to do that in software. We mainly have internships or co-ops, which are generally longer term, and most people probably get one, maybe two, maybe if they're lucky, three before they graduate college. So you maybe have not been exposed to all the different areas of software. Some people may love a traveling job where you attend a bunch of conferences and sort of talk about your technology a lot. Other people may want to work in client services or just work on enterprise apps or work on mobile apps or something. And it's kind of hard to understand what you want before you've tried it, I guess. So I think my advice here is don't be afraid to take a risk. Move
Mm,
somewhere new, try out a new city. Don't be afraid to try something you've never tried before if you have a job offer for it. The worst part is if you hate it, and you might end up hating it, you can always get a new job. People are going to say don't leave your job for 6 months or until 6 months or a year after you join. That's pretty fair, but you can always get a new job after that time or even before that time. And as long as you don't make a habit of it, no one's really going to hold you that accountable for it. I think it's important to find out what's going to get you excited to wake up in the morning and sort of go to work and sort of work on these cool things. I like delivering great experiences to users. I've worked on a variety of mobile apps and now web apps, among other things. And I like shipping things all the time and showing those off and getting feedback and iterating on that. I think that's been super engaging for me and sort of just I've worked on some really cool things that have had a lot of impact and I've been very happy to work on those. And some people may be driven by other things. They may be driven solely by work life balance or monetary compensation and stuff. And it's important to understand what you want from life and sort of to seek that out.
mm. Yeah, I think that's super helpful. The importance of like exploring and finding what really motivates you at the end of the day. And that's something I'm going to work on. So yeah, thank you for that piece of advice. Um, and yeah, I guess just to end this all off, do you have anything you'd like to share, like any like social media links that you want to share, or like any resources that you found to be helpful, anything in general before we end this podcast?
I have to plug LeetCode. I am not affiliated with LeetCode in any way, but if you are trying for interviews, they're a great website that someone's going
They're
to tell
really
you
good.
to go do every easy, medium, and hard before any tech interviews. They're lying to you, but it is a great resource to sort of practice whiteboarding questions. And when you are
Mm,
using it, you should talk out loud and sort of like as if you were in a room with someone going about a question. But there's a lot of resources out there to sort of help you along in your journey, and we are all growing. So don't be afraid to reach out and try to figure out what resources work best for you.
awesome. Yeah, that's super helpful. I love LeetCode. LeetCode's super helpful for preparing for interviews. Um, yeah, thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm super excited to share this with our audience. And yeah, excited to, I guess, see you in like July or whatever when I start working. Very excited for that. So take care.
Yeah,
Hope
thank
you
you
have a
so
great
much for
rest of the
having
day.
me.
Yeah, no problem.